May 1945, Okinawa. Beneath the shattered remains of a civilian home, a young Japanese mother cradled her daughter, convinced that the child would not live to see another sunrise. The girl's wounds were raw red and beginning to rot from days without proper care. For weeks, the family had survived on roots and rainwater while bombs fell and artillery roared. Every Japanese broadcast had warned them of what awaited if captured: rape, torture, and certain death. American soldiers, they were told, were demons in human form. To reveal yourself was to embrace annihilation. When footsteps approached, the mother pressed her child tighter, whispering that the end had come. But instead of brutality, she saw an American medic kneel beside them, open a field kit, and carefully draw a clear fluid into a glass syringe. The man spoke softly in words she could not understand, but his tone carried something she had not heard in months: calm reassurance. The needle slid into the girl's arm, and within hours the fever broke. The angry swelling began to subside. Within days, the wound that should have killed her showed signs of recovery. To the mother, this was not science, but sorcery. She had never seen antibiotics, never heard the word penicillin. In her mind, it was a miracle delivered by the very enemy she had been told to fear. What she could not know in that moment was the scale behind that single injection. By 1945, the United States had mastered the mass production of penicillin, transforming it from a laboratory curiosity into the most valuable medical weapon of the war. In 1942, a dose cost $20 more than a month's wages for many Japanese workers. By 1945, American industry had driven the cost down to 55 cents. From a few thousand units at the start of the conflict, production skyrocketed to more than 650 billion units in the final year alone. Entire factories, more than 100 of them, had been built in record time to ensure that no American soldier would die from infection and that even enemy civilians could be treated. For a nation like Japan, where medicine still relied heavily on herbal remedies and supplies of even basic drugs had collapsed under Allied blockade, the discovery that Americans could casually administer a miracle drug to a wounded child was shattering. Families had been taught that Americans existed only to destroy. Instead, they watched those same Americans wield a technology their own doctors could not dream of, saving lives that their own military had written off as expendable. The shock lay not only in survival, but in the realization of scale. If Americans could spare this precious medicine for the children of their enemies, how much must they possess for their own armies? How powerful was a nation that could turn miracles into mass production, transforming death sentences into routine recoveries? For Japanese civilians, the propaganda collapsed in an instant. The enemy was no longer a faceless demon, but a civilization so vast, so industrially mighty, that it could defeat infection as casually as it destroyed fortresses. And so the mother who had expected to bury her daughter found herself clinging to a new truth. Survival was possible only because her enemy's factories were stronger than her nation's armies. The moment would linger in memory for decades, retold as the day when the impossible happened, when the hated foe revealed a face of mercy backed by an ocean of industrial abundance. Now let me ask you directly, if you were that mother hiding in rubble expecting monsters but finding a man with medicine that saved your child, would you not call it a miracle? Comment 1 below if you believe she was left stunned, unable to comprehend how her enemy had become her savior. Before a single American soldier set foot on Okinawan soil, the battle for Japanese civilians' minds had already been waged. For years, radio broadcasts, neighborhood meetings, and school lessons had woven a single terrifying message. Americans were not human. They were monsters, brutal, sadistic, and merciless. Mothers were told that if captured, their children would be torn apart for amusement. Fathers were warned that surrender meant mutilation, humiliation, and the annihilation of their families. Teachers drilled students with songs glorifying suicide, praising those who leapt from cliffs rather than suffer capture. Every channel of authority reinforced the same doctrine, death before dishonor, because dishonor meant falling into the hands of demons. In villages across Okinawa, this propaganda took physical form. Military police distributed grenades and cyanide capsules, instructing families to use them when defeat was inevitable. Government leaflets showed grotesque cartoons of Americans bayoneting infants, laughing as they violated women burning villages simply for sport. To the people, these images were not exaggerations, but warnings. Rumors spread of entire communities slaughtered in other islands. Few questioned the stories. In a society built on obedience to authority and loyalty to the emperor, what the state declared was truth. The conditioning was so complete that when the thunder of naval bombardment began, many families chose suicide before the enemy even arrived. At cliffsides overlooking the ocean, mothers jumped into the waves, clutching their children. Entire caves filled with civilians were found later, their inhabitants poisoned by their own hand. To them, it was a final act of loyalty, an escape from a fate worse than death. And yet when the American soldiers pushed through shattered towns and ruined homes, the reality contradicted every lesson drilled into the people. Instead of knives raised in cruelty, there were outstretched hands offering water. Instead of mockery and assault, there were medics bending over the wounded, applying bandages, whispering reassurance in broken Japanese. Instead of extermination, there was protection, soldiers carrying children through sniper fire to safety chaplains praying beside Buddhist priests, engineers repairing wells so families could drink clean water again. For civilians who had spent years preparing for horror, this was a psychological earthquake. Everything they believed about the enemy collapsed in a single instant. If the propaganda had been wrong about Americans, what else had it lied about? If the supposed demons saved children who were the true monsters, the foreign soldiers, or the leaders who told mothers to kill their babies rather than accept rescue, the confusion cut deeper than fear ever had. Some civilians could not process what they saw. One woman later recalled that she screamed at an American medic to leave her alone, even as he stitched her wound, convinced it must be a trick. Another man refused food offered by soldiers, fearing it was poisoned, until hunger overcame terror, and he discovered that the bread and meat were real. Slowly, disbelief gave way to reluctant acceptance. The Americans were not demons. They were men often younger than the civilians they rescued, carrying more food and medicine than most Okinawans had seen in their lives. This clash between propaganda and reality produced a profound cognitive dissonance. For years, Japanese leaders had declared that surrender was betrayal, that capture meant disgrace. Yet here stood the enemy, saving lives at risk to their own. The civilians had been told Americans would treat them as subhuman. Instead, they were treated with dignity. The effect was devastating. Propaganda relies on distance. As long as the Americans remained an abstract enemy across the ocean, they could be portrayed as monsters. But face to face, the lies could not hold. A child tasting chocolate for the first time could not be persuaded that the giver was a demon. A mother watching her son survive infection could not believe the rescuer wished her dead. Every act of compassion became a hammer strike against the edifice of indoctrination. This collapse of fear was not universal or immediate. Many still chose death, unable to trust their own eyes after years of indoctrination. But those who survived carried a new truth in their memories. The enemy had shown them humanity their own leaders had denied. And in that truth lay the seed of a larger realization. America's power was not only in its weapons, but in its ability to overturn propaganda with abundance, to transform terror into gratitude, to destroy lies not with words, but with undeniable acts. Now I ask you, if you had been told every day that capture meant horror, and then you watched your wounded child saved by the very men you feared, would your faith in your leaders survive? Comment 8. If you believe that moment shattered trust in the propaganda forever. For the civilians of Okinawa, penicillin seemed like magic. But behind every injection, every life saved, stood an industrial machine of staggering scale, a force so vast that it turned miracles into routine. This was not the story of a single doctor with a syringe. It was the story of a nation whose factories had been transformed into engines of life as much as engines of death. In 1941, penicillin was still rare, a fragile discovery that could be cultivated only in small flasks in a handful of laboratories. At the start of the war, the entire world's supply of the drug could be carried in a single suitcase. For Japan cut off by blockade, even that suitcase was unattainable. But America was different. Within 3 years, the United States had taken a mold scraped from a Petri dish and built an empire of production around it. By 1944, government contracts and corporate laboratories had joined forces Pfizer, Merck, Squibb, and Eli Lilly, turning the trickle into a flood. By 1945, American plants were producing 650 billion units of penicillin a year. 650 billion. Enough to dose every soldier, sailor, airman, and even civilians caught in the crossfire, with a surplus so massive that the drug could be given freely to captured enemies and the children of those who had been taught to hate America. The figures are almost beyond comprehension. The cost of a single dose had plummeted from $20 in 1942, a fortune equal to weeks of wages for a Japanese laborer, to just 55 cents in 1945. What Japan's best hospitals could not dream of affording, American medics could hand out casually in the rubble of Okinawa. Where Japanese soldiers carried grenades to press into the hands of civilians, American soldiers carried glass vials of penicillin. One represented despair, the other abundance. The shock to civilians was not simply that medicine existed, but that it was used without hesitation on enemies. To a starving mother, the idea that Americans could spare such precious resources on her child raised a terrifying question. If this is what they give away, how much more must they keep for themselves? The scale implied was incomprehensible. Consider the contrast. Japanese doctors still relied on traditional herbal brews, camphor, and crude antiseptics. Surgical wounds almost always meant infection, and infection almost always meant death. On the battlefield, Japanese soldiers feared not only bullets, but the fever that followed. Yet the Americans treated infection as an inconvenience, an obstacle swept aside by industrial-strength science. American commanders issued penicillin as casually as they distributed ammunition, and in many ways it was just as decisive a weapon. To Japanese civilians who had lived in darkness, rationing, and deprivation for years, this display of medical plenty was almost more frightening than the bombs. Bombs could be explained by firepower, by arsenals and steel. But to wield the power of life, to pull children back from the edge of death, to reverse infections that had always been fatal, that was godlike. And the Americans possessed this godlike ability in industrial quantities. The truth was undeniable. America's war machine was not only about destruction, it was about creation production and the power to overwhelm both enemies and diseases with the same ruthless efficiency. Factories that by day forged tanks and aircraft by night poured out antibiotics and plasma. In the United States, the line between weapons and medicine blurred because both were products of the same industrial abundance. For Japanese civilians, this realization was devastating. Their government had promised glory, sacrifice, and divine protection. But when wounds came, when infection spread, the divine remained silent. It was the enemy armed with machines, laboratories, and endless supplies that held the power of salvation. The comparison was merciless. On one side, a nation that demanded its people die with honor. On the other, a nation that could save them with a single injection. The civilians could not understand the science, but they understood the implications. If Americans could manufacture so much medicine that they treated even enemy children, then Japan had already lost. Not just on the battlefield, but in the very foundation of civilization. America's strength was not in the individual soldier, but in the vast network of factories, laboratories, and logistics that ensured those soldiers never fought alone. Against such power, no propaganda could stand, no fanaticism could endure. And so the penicillin syringe became more than medicine. It became a symbol of the gap between nations, a reminder that Japan's devotion to death could never match America's devotion to production. The civilians who witnessed it knew, even if they could not admit it aloud, that this was the true face of defeat, not humiliation at the hands of a stronger warrior, but the realization that the enemy's abundance was beyond imagination. Now I ask you, if you were hiding in the ruins, and you saw the enemy inject life into your dying child with medicine your own nation had never provided, would you not recognize that the war was already lost? Comment yes, if you agree that this single act revealed America's victory long before the guns fell silent. The artillery had barely ceased when American patrols began pushing through shattered streets, rifles raised against the ever-present threat of snipers. In the ruins of a collapsed schoolhouse, they heard muffled cries. At first they thought it was a trap. Japanese defenders often used civilians as bait. But when they forced open the rubble, they found a family, 2 children, their grandmother and a mother with blood streaming from her arm. The soldiers could have moved on, securing their sector, focusing only on the fight. Instead, they called for a medic. Within minutes, the children were drinking clean water from canteens, and the grandmother, trembling, watched as a stranger in uniform wrapped her daughter's wound with sterile gauze. The medic then pulled out a vial of penicillin and injected it into the mother's arm. For the family, it was the second miracle in a week. For the Americans, it was just standard procedure. These rescues were not isolated. Across Okinawa, civilians discovered that their survival often depended on the willingness of American soldiers to risk their own lives. In one case, Private First Class Tony Rizzo of Brooklyn volunteered to crawl into a half-destroyed farmhouse where screams had been heard. Snipers were still active, and every inch of movement meant exposure. Yet Rizzo inched forward, ignoring bullets that struck the walls around him, until he reached 2 children pinned under debris. He dragged them out one by one, carrying them to safety, while his comrades laid down suppressive fire. Later, he admitted that it reminded him of the tenement fires he had seen as a child back home. "You don't leave kids behind," he said. For the Japanese who watched in stunned disbelief, the question was unavoidable. If these men were demons, why did they risk death to save strangers? The shock lay not only in the bravery, but in the resources that followed. Once civilians were rescued, they were taken to aid stations, tents filled with supplies the Japanese had never seen. Bandages in neat rolls, sterilized instruments gleaming under lanterns, boxes of powdered milk crates of medical rations stamped with U.S. Army. Children who had been starving were suddenly fed hot soup made from ingredients Americans had carried across the Pacific in bulk. Women suffering from fevers were given quinine and sulfa drugs, names they had never heard, but which worked with astonishing speed. Each treatment, each gesture of care widened the gap between expectation and reality. And still the rescues continued under fire. In the hills near Shuri, Corporal Eddie Rodriguez sprinted through a burning village to reach an old man trapped in his collapsed house. The roof threatened to cave in, but Rodriguez forced open a path, shielding the man with his body, until others could carry him out. In another sector, Sergeant James Sullivan, a medic from Chicago dragged a wounded Japanese boy out of a trench while bullets snapped past his helmet. Sullivan later wrote in his report, "I was trained to treat combat wounds, but nothing prepared me for starving kids and dying old people. We gave them what we had. Sometimes it wasn't enough, but at least they knew someone tried." For Japanese civilians, these moments were incomprehensible. Their own army had left them behind, ordering them to die rather than surrender. Yet here were the enemy's soldiers braving fire to deliver not death, but protection. The contradiction was unbearable. Who then was the true defender of the people, the emperor's soldiers, or the foreigners who carried both rifles and medicine? The power of these rescues lay in repetition. It was not one lucky encounter, not one unusual soldier. Across Okinawa, story after story spread Americans pulling children from rubble, carrying mothers on stretchers, sharing rations with orphans. Each story reinforced the same truth: this was not an accident, not a trick. It was policy. It was abundance. It was America. The civilians began to whisper among themselves. Perhaps surrender was not dishonor. Perhaps survival was not betrayal. Perhaps the enemy who saved your child was less terrifying than the leaders who told you to kill your child before help could come. And in that whisper lay the slow unraveling of years of propaganda. Imagine the terror of hiding in darkness, believing death inevitable, and then watching a man in a foreign uniform crawl through fire to lift your child into his arms. Would you not feel the ground of your beliefs collapse beneath you? Comment okay if you agree that such rescues destroyed fear more effectively than any weapon. When the guns fell silent for a few hours and the smoke cleared from shattered villages, the survivors began to process what had happened. For many, the realization struck harder than any shell. They had been told since childhood that Americans were demons who took pleasure in torment, that capture was worse than death, that to accept mercy was to betray the emperor. Yet there they were alive, because the enemy had chosen to save them. It was not just survival. It was the collapse of an entire belief system. Mothers whispered in the ruins that they had seen their children healed by American doctors. Old men told neighbors how soldiers had shared rations when their own army had abandoned them. Word spread quickly, as word always does in war carried by those who had nothing left but memory. Each story chipped away at the wall of fear built by propaganda. Slowly, suspicion gave way to doubt, and doubt gave way to gratitude. The emotions were complex, layered with pain. Some felt humiliation. How could it be that the emperor's soldiers, sworn to protect the people, had ordered families to kill themselves while the enemy fought to keep them alive? How could the government that demanded endless sacrifice provide so little while foreigners provided food, medicine, and even kindness? The shame was unbearable. Survivors later admitted that they wept not only from relief, but from anger that they had been lied to, anger that their loyalty had been betrayed. At the same time, there was undeniable gratitude. A mother whose child survived infection carried that memory for the rest of her life, her heart torn between hatred taught by the state and love owed to the stranger who saved her child. One boy, who decades later recalled his first taste of chocolate from an American soldier, said simply, "It was the moment I knew the war was over." For civilians, gratitude was not just an emotion, it was a survival mechanism. To acknowledge kindness was to reclaim humanity in the midst of dehumanization. For the Americans, the reversal was just as powerful. Many soldiers had spent years fighting an enemy that refused to surrender, an enemy that launched suicidal charges, an enemy described as fanatical and inhuman. They expected hatred, not gratitude. Yet here were Japanese families bowing in thanks, children laughing with gum and candy in their mouths, old women pressing their foreheads to the ground in respect. The soldiers wrote home about it, astonished that compassion could be returned across such a gulf of blood. This psychological reversal mattered more than bombs or bullets. A bomb can destroy a building, but gratitude can destroy ideology. Every family that survived because of American medicine carried a story into the post-war years. Every child who lived grew up knowing that the demon was a lie. In living rooms across Okinawa, around the fires of refugee camps, the same truth was spoken again and again: the enemy saved us when our own leaders abandoned us. That sentence carried more weight than any military victory. And so the war for hearts and minds, which the Japanese state had tried to win with terror, was lost in the quiet moments of rescue. Hatred withered, replaced by a reluctant recognition that America's strength was not only in weapons, but in mercy born of abundance. The power of gratitude lay in its permanence. Bombs fade, ruins are rebuilt, but memories of survival endure. For many Japanese, those memories reshaped how they saw not just the war, but the world. If you had been taught all your life that an enemy was less than human, and then that same enemy saved your child, would you not feel both shame and gratitude? Comment 9. If you believe such moments changed Japanese hearts more than any battlefield victory ever could. For the civilians of Okinawa, the shock of being saved by enemy medicine was deeply personal. But behind every bandage, every vial of penicillin, loomed a larger truth, a truth measured not in emotions, but in numbers. War in the end is arithmetic, and the arithmetic of 1945 left no room for doubt. Consider penicillin. By the summer of 1945, the United States had produced more than 650 billion units of the drug. In practical terms, this meant that infections which had killed millions throughout history could now be defeated with a single injection. By contrast, Japan's entire medical system could muster only a few thousand doses of primitive antibiotics, and most hospitals were reduced to using herbal poultices and saltwater rinses. To a mother whose child was saved by an American medic, this disparity was not abstract. It was life and death. The same chasm stretched across every sector of war. In 1944, alone, American factories built 96,000 aircraft. That is more than 8,000 planes every month, more than 250 every single day. Entire squadrons were replaced in weeks. Japan, by comparison, produced fewer than 28,000 aircraft. In that same year, many of them obsolete or assembled from inferior materials. By 1945, American bombers flew over Japan in such numbers that civilians described the sound as a constant thunder. For the people below, it was not the sound of individual machines, but of an entire continent in motion. Tanks told the same story. The United States built more than 88,000 armored vehicles during the war, steel beasts rolling off assembly lines with the same rhythm as automobiles. Japan produced fewer than 2,500 most lightly armored and hopelessly outclassed. For Okinawan farmers who had never seen a tank until the American invasion, the appearance of these machines, tens of tons of steel, supported by endless convoys of trucks, proved that the battlefield was only one piece of a much larger machine. Fuel was perhaps the most decisive number of all. By 1945, American oil production reached nearly 1.8 billion barrels annually. Convoys carried gasoline across oceans, filling steel drums and tank farms that seemed limitless. German prisoners of war had already been stunned to see Americans burn millions of gallons of fuel rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Japanese civilians now witnessed the same truth in different form. American trucks never stopped their jeeps, and tanks always had full tanks, their planes always enough fuel to return and strike again. Japan cut off from its colonial oil fields, rationed gasoline so severely that civilians often walked barefoot to conserve shoes while soldiers fought with empty tanks. Even food became a weapon of arithmetic. American soldiers received rations that included canned meat crackers, chocolate coffee, and even cigarettes. Civilians in Okinawa, half-starved after months of siege, were handed the same rations, shocked that the enemy could share luxuries their own nation had denied them. A single American K-ration for one soldier often contained more calories than an entire Japanese family had eaten in days. When a people who had been told the enemy would devour them instead received chocolate, they could only conclude that the war had already been lost long before the fighting reached their homes. What these numbers revealed was not simply superiority, but inevitability. Japan could not replace its losses. America could replace entire armies. Japan rationed every drop of medicine. America produced so much that it spilled over into the hands of enemies. Japanese leaders spoke of honor and sacrifice, but American factories turned those words to ash, proving that no amount of will could bridge the gap between scarcity and abundance. For civilians who saw the numbers play out in daily life convoys of trucks, stretching beyond the horizon, bombers blotting out the sun food, distributed in endless crates, the realization was brutal. Their nation had asked them to die for the emperor. America demonstrated that it could keep its own soldiers alive, and even its enemies, simply by producing more of everything. This was not merely defeat. It was exposure. Exposure of the lie that Japan's spirit could overcome America's steel. And so the comparison became a judgment, not on the courage of soldiers but on the systems behind them. Japan had asked for death. America had delivered life at industrial scale. The cold arithmetic proved what the civilians already sensed in their hearts. The war had been decided not on Okinawa's cliffs, but in the furnaces and factories of Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. If you were a civilian staring at the endless stream of American trucks, the crates of food, the vials of medicine, and then looking at your own empty hands, would you not realize the truth? Comment 2. If you agree that wars are decided in factories long before they are fought in villages. When the last shots of Okinawa faded into silence, the survivors carried with them more than scars and ruins. They carried memories of moments when the line between enemy and savior blurred, when compassion crossed the battlefield and shattered everything they had been taught to believe. These memories, though born of defeat, became the foundation of something larger than survival. They became the seeds of peace. For one mother, the memory was the face of a medic leaning over her child, sweat dripping from his brow as he injected penicillin into a festering wound. She would later say that she had expected to bury her daughter. Instead, she watched her live. For another family, it was the sight of American engineers repairing a well so that the village could drink clean water again. For a boy, it was the first taste of chocolate handed to him by a soldier who smiled like a brother rather than snarled like a monster. These were small acts in the eyes of those who performed them, but for those who received them, they were unforgettable. Japan's leaders had demanded that civilians throw themselves from cliffs, that families poison their children, that surrender be avoided at any cost. America, by contrast, gave life where death was expected. The paradox was too powerful to ignore. The emperor's soldiers had brought ruin. The enemy's soldiers had brought survival. Civilians whispered the truth to each other in the rubble, a truth that no propaganda could erase. The Americans had treated them not as animals to be exterminated, but as humans worth saving. Decades later, when survivors told their stories, the emotion remained raw. Many admitted they had lived with guilt for accepting help from enemies, guilt for surviving when neighbors had chosen suicide, guilt for feeling gratitude toward men they had been told to hate. But alongside the guilt was something stronger, the recognition that those acts of mercy had changed them. The memory of kindness in the middle of devastation was something they passed to their children not as shame, but as proof that humanity could outlast hatred. For the American soldiers, the transformation was equally lasting. They had entered Okinawa expecting fanatics only to discover families cowering in basements, desperate for help. To save those families, to give them food and medicine, was to realize that the enemy was not a faceless mass, but people who cried, laughed, and bled the same as anyone else. Many soldiers wrote home about it, describing the shock of being thanked by civilians they had been trained to fear. These letters became part of a different war, a war for memory shaping how Americans thought about their former enemies once peace finally came. The strategic impact was undeniable. By demonstrating mercy backed by abundance, America achieved something bombs alone could not. Civilians who had expected slaughter instead became witnesses to generosity. Their testimonies spread undermining propaganda more effectively than any leaflet. In the years that followed, this reservoir of memory helped smooth the path toward alliance. Japan, once an implacable enemy, would become a partner. And at the heart of that transformation were not only treaties and governments, but the stories of mothers and children who had seen mercy in the rubble. This was the ultimate paradox of Okinawa. The same nation that unleashed overwhelming destruction also revealed overwhelming compassion. The same soldiers who carried rifles also carried medicine. The same power that could burn cities to ashes could also rebuild wells, schools, and homes. For civilians, the shock was eternal. The enemy had shown them a future beyond death. And so when survivors looked back on the war, the most haunting memory was not of bombs falling or bullets cracking, but of American hands reaching out through smoke and dust to lift them into safety. Those hands carried not only lives, but the hope that hatred need not be forever, that even enemies could find common humanity when industry and abundance made mercy possible. This is the lesson that endures, that America's victory wasn't only measured in battles won or enemies defeated, but in the lives saved through its capacity to produce beyond imagining. Guns may end wars, but it is abundance that reshapes futures. For Japanese civilians, the shock of survival became the first step toward reconciliation, and the miracle of medicine became the memory of peace. And now I ask you if you believe that mercy backed by overwhelming strength can change enemies into allies. Comment yes to remind the world that compassion is the true victory of war.
March 9, 1945, midnight. Over the dark waters of Tokyo Bay, the first engines began to hum. To the Japanese soldiers manning anti-aircraft batteries along the riverfront, the sound was unfamiliar, deep, steady, mechanical. Not the sharp buzz of the B-25s or the drone of older bombers they had faced before. This was heavier layered, as if the sky itself had turned into an enormous machine. Within minutes, the night was trembling. One lookout raised his binoculars toward the south. At first he saw only scattered red lights moving slowly in formation. Then the realization struck him they weren't stars. They were hundreds of engines moving in perfect rhythm. The air defenses sounded no alarm. Radar operators were confused. The altitudes were too high, the echoes too many. Some thought it was a training flight. Others whispered that the Americans could not possibly reach Tokyo. Yet the sound kept growing, a low metallic heartbeat rolling over the bay. At 12:08 a.m., the first wave of B-29s crossed the coastline. Each aircraft carried nearly 7 tons of incendiaries, small bomblets packed with napalm gel and magnesium powder. The crews called them fire sticks. When they dropped, the sky split open. Thousands of canisters burst in midair, scattering burning fragments that fell like orange snow. Within minutes, the wooden houses of eastern Tokyo began to ignite one by one until entire blocks turned into rolling waves of flame. Eyewitnesses later said the air itself seemed to burn. Heat rose so fiercely that men's uniforms burst into flame. Oxygen vanished. People suffocated standing up, From his bunker near the Imperial Palace, a Japanese civil defense officer watched the city glow brighter than sunrise. He shouted orders into a phone that no longer worked. Water pressure had failed. Fire engines melted in the streets. Crews tried to fight back with sand buckets. Nothing helped. Above them, the American bombers flew on steady as conveyor belts, each one releasing its load on schedule. At 1:00 a.m., Tokyo's firestorms merged into a single continuous inferno stretching 6 miles across. Temperatures reached over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Asphalt ran like lava. Entire families vanished before they could scream. By 3:00 a.m., 334 B-29s had dropped 1,065 tons of incendiaries. 96,000 people were dead, 1 million homeless, 16 square miles erased. And yet the bombers kept coming one formation after another, as if the night had no end. Japanese gunners fired blindly into the glowing smoke, but their shells burst far below the invisible giants above. The officer wrote later in his report, "We fired until the barrels melted. The sky did not bleed. It only roared." For the first time, Tokyo understood that the war had entered a different age. These were not ordinary raids, not aircraft in the sense they had known. The Americans had turned industry itself into a weapon. Each B-29 was not just a plane, it was a flying factory of death assembled by thousands of hands across a continent, delivered through oceans of fuel and metal that Japan could no longer imagine possessing. When dawn came, the city was still burning smoke, rising 12,000 feet into the sky. The few survivors wandered among ruins where streets no longer existed. If you had been standing in that darkness, watching the sky rain fire until even the rivers boiled, what would you have thought? Would you believe that a single nation could build so many machines that the world itself could not stop them? Comment 1 if you think no defense could ever survive that night, or hit like if you believe courage alone should have meant something. Before the fire, there was certainty. In the winter of 1944, Japanese commanders gathered inside underground map rooms, tracing neat red lines across the Pacific, still convinced that the empire's circle of defense was intact. Tokyo lay more than 2,000 miles from the nearest American base. Every briefing began with the same conclusion: no enemy aircraft can reach the home islands. That phrase became a comfort, a shield of words that replaced reality. When the first reports came of strange silver bombers flying from the Marianas, most officers dismissed them as exaggerated. One colonel laughed, saying it would be easier for them to build a bridge from Guam to Tokyo than to fly that far. They trusted distance more than technology, faith more than fuel. Japan's Air Defense Command had fewer than 200 interceptors to guard the capital, most of them obsolete twin-engine fighters that struggled to climb beyond 25,000 feet. The newest Zero models had already lost their edge. Thin armor, limited altitude, and shortages of high-octane fuel turned them into fragile relics. By contrast, the Americans were sending aircraft that operated in a different world. The Boeing B-29 Super Fortress cruised above 10,000 meters where Japanese guns could barely reach, and where oxygen masks froze to the faces of defenders who tried. The Japanese believed their island was protected by nature itself, but they were about to discover that industry could erase distance as easily as erasing a line on a map. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, senior officers clung to reports that confirmed their optimism. Radar systems, they insisted, would give ample warning. Fighter bases would intercept the enemy long before he reached the city. But most radar stations had been destroyed by earlier raids or lacked spare tubes to operate. Communication cables lay shattered after years of bombardment. Pilots trained on gasoline so scarce that each man was allowed only one full flight a week. Mechanics used scrap metal for replacement parts. Yet official communiques still declared, the skies above the Emperor remained secure. Even when intelligence officers intercepted American broadcasts boasting of super fortresses assembled in Kansas and flown to Saipan, they considered it propaganda. The very idea that a bomber could carry 9 tons of explosives over 3,000 miles seemed impossible. Japan's engineers calculated the fuel requirements and concluded such an aircraft would never lift off. They did not realize that, in America, factories were producing engines with more horsepower than all of Japan's automotive industry combined. In Tokyo, civilians shared that same illusion. The government had taught them that the empire's divine spirit could repel any enemy. The newspapers published paintings of heroic pilots intercepting ghostly bombers over Mount Fuji. Women sewed banners that read, "No American shall reach our sky." Children drilled with bamboo spears while teachers promised that the gods protected Japan. They believed because they needed to. Then came the test. On November 24, 1944, 97 B-29s appeared above Tokyo for the first time. Flying at 30,000 feet, they released their bombs in daylight beyond the reach of most interceptors. The Japanese anti-aircraft shells exploded far below useless blossoms of smoke. Out of the entire attack, only 2 bombers were lost, one to mechanical failure, another to a lucky shot. It should have been enough to shatter faith, but the Army's communiques spun it as a victory. The enemy withdrew under heavy fire. Damage minimal. That night, officers toasted to their own reports while factory workers buried the bodies of hundreds killed in silence. The illusion deepened into denial. Engineers insisted that the Americans had used a special tailwind. The Navy promised to develop new radar-guided guns. None of it mattered. By early 1945, Japan was running out of everything fuel, aluminum, copper, even paper for maps. Yet they still believed they could outlast the enemy through willpower. A pilot of the 47th Sentai later recalled, "We thought courage could make up for steel. We thought our blood was worth more than their machines." He smiled bitterly in an interview after the war. "We were wrong. Their machines had more blood than we did." The Empire's commanders did not understand that the Americans were no longer fighting a war of men, but a war of production lines. Every B-29 they shot down was replaced before the wreckage cooled. Every pilot lost had 3 trained replacements waiting. Japan, by comparison, was losing both men and the means to replace them. By the time of the Great Raid in March, the illusion of safety was already dead. It just hadn't been buried yet. If you were one of those officers staring at the empty fuel drums and hearing that hundreds of bombers had crossed an ocean to reach you, would you still believe in divine protection? Comment 1, if you think faith could never stand against factories or hit. Like if you believe human spirit might still have changed the ending. The first time they saw a B-29 up close, most Japanese defenders didn't believe it was real. On radar, it appeared as a cluster of signals too large to be a single aircraft. Through binoculars, it looked impossibly bright sunlight glinting off silver skin that seemed to stretch endlessly across the sky. One lieutenant wrote later in his diary, "It was like looking at a piece of the future. We had rifles. They had the sky." From the observation towers around Yokohama and Chiba, soldiers watched them come in formation, 4 engines each, flying higher than any interceptor could reach. The contrails formed perfect white lines over the blue horizon, geometric and unnatural, as though drawn by a machine rather than a pilot. They didn't maneuver or scatter under fire. They simply moved forward, calm and mechanical, like a production line in motion. Even veteran pilots who had fought over China and the Pacific could not comprehend it. They flew too high to touch too fast to chase too heavy to destroy 1-0, pilot said later. It was not war. It was like trying to shoot at a planet. Each B-29 carried more weight in fuel and ammunition than an entire Japanese fighter squadron could lift. Its Wright R-3350 engines, 4 of them, generated nearly 9,000 horsepower. The planes were fitted with remote-controlled gun turrets, radar-assisted bombing sights, and armor plating thicker than anything the Japanese had ever seen on an aircraft. A single super fortress could stay aloft for more than 14 hours longer than most Japanese patrols, lasted for an entire week. When the first formations appeared over Tokyo in late 1944, anti-aircraft gunners opened fire in desperation. The shells detonated harmlessly 1,000 meters below. In command bunkers, officers shouted coordinates to artillery crews who couldn't even see the enemy. The B-29s seemed to hang in the stratosphere like silver ghosts, perfectly still, perfectly untouchable. For the Japanese, the shock wasn't just the physical reality of the bombers, it was what they represented. They weren't aircraft built for a single mission. They were flying testaments to an industrial machine that Japan could never match. Each B-29 was assembled from 1,400 factories across the United States engines, from Ohio, aluminum from Michigan Electronics, from New York, and guns from Illinois. The logistics of creating and fueling one bomber exceeded the resources of entire Japanese prefectures. Pilots sent to intercept them returned shaking. Their guns froze at altitude, their engines coughed from bad fuel. Even when they managed to climb within range, their bullets bounced off the bombers' bellies. One sergeant described firing an entire belt of ammunition into a B-29 that kept flying straight unshaken. I hit it again and again. It was like shooting at a train made of mirrors. Inside the bombers, American crews looked down through thick clouds at cities that looked like paper models. They followed checklists, called out altitudes, adjusted their Norden bomb sights. There was no emotion in their voices, only procedure. At 30,000 feet, war became mathematics. Each click of a switch released tons of destruction, calculated, timed, precise. Japanese defenders could feel that cold precision even from below. They attacked like machines, one survivor said. No hatred, no hurry, no fear, just rhythm. When the bombers released their loads, the sky did not thunder, it shimmered. Thousands of small firebombs burst open in midair, scattering trails of burning chemicals that fell silently before roaring to life. Within minutes, districts vanished behind waves of flame. The men on the ground stopped firing, watching helplessly as the sky itself turned red. One major radioed headquarters, his voice trembling. They are not aircraft. They are factories dropping factories of fire. Reports from the field grew more surreal. Anti-aircraft crews claimed that the bombers seemed to regenerate, that for every one shot down, 3 more appeared. In truth, the formations were so large that the human mind couldn't process them. At night, their navigation lights merged into a single glowing horizon. From the streets of Tokyo, it looked like a second city floating above the first. People pointed upward, whispering that America had built a city of the gods. The Japanese Air Command tried to respond with new tactics, night fighters, balloon barrages, and even suicide interceptors, but none worked. The B-29s simply climbed higher, dropped faster, and came back the next night. There was no rhythm of offense and defense anymore, only a continuous rain of metal and flame. The Empire's defenders realized they were facing not an army, but a process, an endless conveyor of destruction, powered by factories they would never see. As one naval officer wrote after the war, we had thought war was a contest of courage. The Americans showed us it was a contest of capacity. They built faster than we could bleed. If you had been there watching 1,000 bombers move across the sky like an assembly line of thunder, would you have felt anger or awe? Comment 1 if you think nothing human could stand against that kind of machine or hit, like if you believe willpower might still have changed fate. To understand why Tokyo burned, one must leave the ruins and travel across an ocean to the assembly lines, the warehouses, and the roaring furnaces of a nation that had turned its factories into wings. In 1943, while Japan's cities rationed electricity and smelted church bells for scrap America's industrial heartland, was working 3 shifts a day under floodlights that never dimmed. The hum of machinery in Kansas, Ohio, and Michigan was the sound of victory being manufactured. Each B-29 superfortress was a continent in miniature. Over 1,400 factories contributed to its birth. The aluminum for its frame came from Pittsburgh. The hydraulic systems were cast in Chicago. The engines rolled out of Pratt & Whitney's plant in Hartford. The propellers were shaped in Hamilton, Ohio. The bomb sites were assembled in secret rooms in New York, guarded as closely as atomic research. In Kansas, at the Boeing plant in Wichita, 40,000 workers, many of them women, riveted the gleaming fuselages that stretched like endless corridors of silver. When a plane was finished, it was towed out onto the Prairie Airfield, fuel-tested, and flown away the same day. A new bomber took off every 90 minutes. No one in Japan could comprehend such speed. In the empire's own factories, shortages crippled everything. Aluminum came from scavenged wreckage. Engineers hand-shaped panels because presses had no electricity. It took months to complete a single heavy bomber. Across the Pacific, American factories measured production by the hour. Boeing, Bell, and Martin built nearly 4,000 B-29s in less than 2 years, each costing more than $500,000 each, supported by a network of subcontractors spanning the entire United States. The industrial miracle that powered them consumed 167,000 tons of aluminum, 1.5 million horsepower in engines, and enough electrical wire to wrap around the Earth twice. The workers building them weren't soldiers. They were teenagers, mothers, machinists, and farmers turned welders. Yet their discipline mirrored the precision of the aircraft themselves. On the walls of assembly halls, signs read, "The faster we work, the fewer men die." Women wearing kerchiefs guided rivet guns into place with practiced rhythm. Each bolt tightened was a promise that someone's son might come home alive. To them, war was not fought with bullets, it was fought with deadlines. The scale of coordination was unimaginable to Japan's planners. When an engine plant in Detroit needed magnesium, a convoy of trucks left Idaho that night. When a factory in Texas required copper, trains from Utah rolled nonstop across 4 states. The entire country moved like one living organism. Oil refineries on the Gulf Coast pumped aviation fuel into pipelines that fed directly into California docks. From there, tankers carried it to island bases where airfields waited like stepping stones across the Pacific. By the time Japan saw the first B-29s in their skies, the logistical network to support them stretched 10,000 miles without a single link missing. Inside the War Production Board in Washington, charts covered entire walls graphs of output tonnage and fuel reserves climbing higher each month. The chairman famously said, "We are not fighting Germany and Japan. We are outproducing them." He was right. In 1944 alone, the United States produced more aircraft than Japan, Germany, and Italy combined. And while the empire's factories shrank under bombing raids, America's multiplied. Entire new cities appeared around production centers, Wichita, Fort Worth, Marietta, each one, a human hive dedicated to a single purpose, building the machines that would end the war. From the Japanese perspective, this defied understanding. Their spies reported that American assembly lines used conveyor belts half a mile long that workers rotated in 12-hour shifts, and that machine tools were replaced the moment efficiency dropped. "They waste more metal in a day than we have in a month," one intelligence officer wrote. What he called waste was actually abundance. The Americans treated material as infinite because for them it nearly was. They drew strength not from a single factory, but from a system that could not be bombed into submission. Even the fuel that carried the B-29s came from invisible cities of steel. Refineries in Louisiana and Texas produced over 200 million barrels of aviation gasoline each year. Japan's total capacity was less than 5 million. Every gallon burned over Tokyo was proof that the Pacific Ocean had become a conveyor belt delivering death. And yet, from the American point of view, it was simply logistics numbers on a chart, trains on a timetable. One Japanese engineer captured as a prisoner after the war was shown a diagram of the B-29 supply chain. He stared at it in silence for nearly an hour before whispering, "This is not an air force. This is a civilization. That realization spread through Japan as reports came in describing the bombers' resilience. Even when hit, they often returned safely to their bases in Guam or Saipan. Within days, replacements were already en route. Every wrecked aircraft was studied, repaired, or replaced with parts pulled from the same vast system that had built it. It was war conducted with the logic of a factory floor: constant motion, constant renewal. For Japan, whose soldiers were taught that courage was infinite and resources were finite, this was a reversal of nature itself. The Americans had discovered a new law of warfare, that machines multiplied by organization could create something resembling immortality. The Empire's commanders realized too late that they were fighting not just the U.S. Army Air Forces, but Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Kansas City. Each city was a battlefield producing victories they could not see until the fire reached their own. As one admiral wrote in his final report, "We thought we were fighting men. We were fighting machines built by men who never came to the front." If you had known that your enemy's strength was being forged by millions of unseen hands, would you still have believed that bravery alone could decide the war? Comment 1. If you think industry always wins over courage, or hit. Like if you believe human will can still overcome a machine built by nations. March 9, 1945. The sun had barely set when the first warning sirens wailed over Tokyo. Few paid attention anymore. Air raids had become a nightly ritual: fleeting flashes, distant thunder, then silence. But this night would not end in silence. From the east came a deep mechanical rumble, a vibration that rolled across the bay like the pulse of a living engine. In bunkers beneath the city, officers listened to the reports pouring in. Radar screens showed hundreds of contacts moving steadily toward the capital. Altitude 2,000 meters, a technician shouted in disbelief. The Americans were flying low. No one understood why. It would soon become clear. At 11:58 p.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft of the 313th Bomb Wing appeared over the city. The lead bombardier toggled a switch. Dozens of M47 napalm bombs fell, their magnesium casings bursting into white stars that marked the target area. The markers glowed in the dark like a constellation forming over the Sumida River. Then came the second wave, more than 300 B-29s flying in tight lines only 60 seconds apart. Each carried a mixture of M69 incendiary clusters and smaller magnesium canisters designed not to explode, but to burn. When they opened their bomb bays, Tokyo's fate came out of the sky in liquid fire. Witnesses described it as a red rain. The bomblets struck rooftops and burst their gel adhesive, splattering across wood and paper walls. In seconds, entire neighborhoods ignited. Fire spread faster than anyone had thought possible, leaping from block to block with the speed of wind. People tried to flee toward canals, but the water boiled before they reached it. The city's firefighting units, already crippled by fuel shortages, were overwhelmed in minutes. Water mains ruptured under the heat. Hydrants hissed steam. The air turned solid with smoke. From the cockpit of one B-29, Major Thomas Farabee looked down and saw what he later called a sea of fire that breathed. He could feel the updraft shake his bomber as the firestorm consumed oxygen and created its own hurricane. Winds reached 100 miles per hour, strong enough to tear roofs from buildings and hurl burning debris into the sky. At ground level, the temperature exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. Asphalt melted into rivers. Air raid shelters turned into ovens. Thousands suffocated before the flames ever touched them. Japanese anti-aircraft guns fired wildly. Their crews were blinded by smoke, choking on heat and dust. At the Imperial Palace, guards watched sparks fall like rain across the moat. The fire reflected in the water made it look as if the city itself had sunk into lava. One officer wrote in his logbook, "We are watching the death of Tokyo." By 2:00 a.m., the firestorm had merged into one continuous inferno. The sound was beyond description, a combination of roaring wind, collapsing timber, and human screams carried by the heat. Pilots flying above reported that the glare was visible 150 miles away. Navigators didn't need instruments. The target marked itself with its own light. The Americans flew through turbulence caused not by weather, but by the rising column of heat that reached 10,000 feet. Yet the operation continued with mechanical precision. Each bomber arrived on time, dropped its load, and turned for home. There was no emotion, no hesitation, just the rhythm of production applied to destruction. On the ground, panic dissolved into silence. Civilians who tried to cross bridges found them collapsing beneath their feet. Mothers pressed wet cloths to their children's faces, only to realize the water had turned to steam. The Sumida River became a trap where thousands drowned, unable to escape the heat above. In Ueno and Asakusa, entire districts disappeared within an hour. The wind carried burning embers into the suburbs, igniting houses miles from the initial strike zone. The city's wooden heart had become kindling. By 3:00 a.m., 16 square miles were burning. Command posts stopped transmitting. Generators melted. The fire consumed the oxygen from the tunnels where civilians had taken shelter. One survivor recalled, "The air was fire. Breathing was pain." He crawled from the ruins at dawn and saw nothing recognizable. No streets, no houses, only an endless plain of ash and twisted metal. The bodies lay in lines as if arranged by the wind. When the bombers returned to their bases on Saipan, mechanics counted 334 aircraft. Only 14 were lost. The rest had completed the mission without serious resistance. It was the most devastating single air raid in human history, more deadly than the atomic blasts that would follow months later. Over 100,000 people were dead, 1 million homeless, and the capital of the Japanese Empire reduced to embers. At dawn, General Curtis LeMay studied reconnaissance photos. His analysts calculated that 1/4 of Tokyo's buildings no longer existed. He said only, "We'll do the next city tomorrow." To him, it was logistics, not cruelty, an equation of tonnage and distance. To the people beneath it was apocalypse. Inside Japan's war ministry, silence replaced orders. Communication with the fire zones was impossible. Officers stared at the map of Tokyo, still colored green on their charts, knowing it was now gray. One colonel muttered, "Even the gods have left us." Another replied, "No, they have joined the Americans." In the following days, survivors wandered the ruins in disbelief. The smell of ash clung to everything. A priest at Asakusa Temple wrote, "The city no longer belongs to the living. It belongs to the wind." The army attempted to spin the event as a temporary setback, but everyone knew the truth. Japan's capital had been erased in 6 hours by machines it could not stop. From across the Pacific, American newspapers printed the photographs with headlines celebrating industrial triumph. "Super fortresses turned Tokyo into rubble," one read. The articles described the bomb load, the fuel logistics, the exact number of planes involved, facts presented like statistics from a factory report. To the Americans, it was efficiency. To the Japanese, it was the end of the world delivered with mathematical precision. A young pilot who survived the raid wrote later, "I watched the bombers pass overhead, each one releasing fire at the same second, the same angle. It was as if their hearts beat together. We could not even hate them. They were not men anymore. They were a process." If you had stood in those burning streets watching the sky rain gasoline until the air itself caught fire, what would you have felt? Rage, despair, or the cold realization that the war was already lost? Comment 1. If you believe no courage could survive that night, or hit. Like if you think faith should still burn even when cities turn to ash. The morning after the firestorm, Tokyo was a wound that refused to cool. Smoke still rose in slow spirals above the ruins as military staff cars picked their way through melted streets. The men inside those cars, the generals, the engineers, the bureaucrats who had once spoken of divine destiny, sat in silence. There were no words left that could match what they saw. Whole neighborhoods had disappeared from existence. Bridges were black bones over empty rivers. In the distance, the imperial palace still stood untouched by luck or irony, surrounded by a sea of ash. For the first time in the war, no one claimed victory. Inside the imperial general headquarters, the atmosphere was not rage, but disbelief. Reports arrived from field inspectors who spoke in whispers, no communication with the fire districts, all firefighting units destroyed, civil population in total panic. The communications officer wept openly at his desk. A major read aloud the casualty figures, 100,000 dead, and paused, unable to continue. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the army staff, closed his eyes and said quietly, "It is the beginning of the end." That afternoon, a small group of officers gathered in a conference room beneath the palace. They studied reconnaissance photos captured by their own aircraft. The city was gone 16 square miles, erased, 36,000 buildings destroyed. Every major factory within the capital had been reduced to slag. The Industrial Ministry reported that even the electrical grid was beyond repair. The general in charge of air defense tried to explain that the Americans had used special incendiaries, that weather conditions had magnified the effect. No one answered. They all knew it would happen again and again until nothing remained. For years, Japan's leaders had convinced themselves that spirit could overcome steel. They had built an empire on the myth that courage could replace coal and oil. But as the report spread through the ministries, that illusion died. The logistics section calculated that each American raid consumed more fuel than Japan's entire weekly aviation supply. The Navy noted that the United States was producing 80 million barrels of aviation gasoline per month, while Japan barely refined 4 million in a year. Even if they stopped losing ships, even if every pilot fought to the death, the arithmetic was final. General Hideki Tojo, once the symbol of defiance, wrote in his notebook, "This war is no longer fought by men, but by factories, and our factories are ashes." Another officer compared the B-29 to a force of nature, not an enemy, but a phenomenon. They had no weapon to counter it, no doctrine to confront it, no hope to match it. The empire's proud concept of decisive battle, one blow to decide the fate of nations, was meaningless. Against an opponent who could rebuild faster than Japan, could bury its dead. In the Navy, Admiral Sumu Toyota faced a similar reckoning. His staff informed him that ship production had fallen by 80% since 1942, while American output had doubled. The admiral stared at the numbers and said, "We cannot sink enough ships. For every one we destroy, 10 appear." When an aide suggested negotiating a truce, Toyota replied, "It is too late for truce. They will negotiate only with our ashes." The psychological collapse was as complete as the physical one. Pilots volunteered for kamikaze missions not out of fanaticism, but because they saw no alternative. Factories ran on scraps of metal and hope. Civilians dug shelters they knew would not save them. Every man understood that Japan's defeat was not a question of bravery, but of mathematics. One engineer captured the sentiment best. They have found a way to turn distance into nothing and metal into infinity. When American bombers returned 2 nights later to burn Nagoya, no one ordered resistance. The radar operators watched their screens fill with dots, then turned away. A commander muttered, "We can do nothing but count them." The officers who had once shouted about honor now prayed only for the war to end before there was nothing left to defend. In the months that followed, the same firestorms swept across Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama. Each time Japan's leaders met, debated, and wrote new plans that meant nothing. The empire had entered the stage of acknowledgement, the slow, painful understanding that the war was lost not in the skies, but in the factories they never built. If you were one of those generals staring at the ruins of your capital, realizing that courage, discipline, and faith had been crushed by steel and gasoline, what would you have done? Comment 1 if you think surrender was inevitable from that moment, or hit like if you believed there was still one last fight left in them. When the smoke finally cleared over Tokyo, the city looked less like a capital and more like a warning carved into the earth. The streets where millions had once walked were gone, replaced by a silent plain of ashes that stretched to the horizon. What remained was not just the physical ruin of a nation, but the proof of a new kind of war, a war in which faith and courage meant less than horsepower, and where victory was measured in tons of steel, gallons of fuel, and hours on a production schedule. In the years that followed, Japanese officers who survived the war tried to explain what had happened. Some blamed weather, others the cruelty of the enemy, but the wisest among them admitted the truth. "We lost one admiral," wrote the moment we believed bravery could replace industry. The empire had built temples of discipline, but no factories of abundance. Its warriors carried honor in their hearts, but no oil in their tanks. Across the ocean, America had turned every city into an armory, every worker into a soldier, and every factory whistle into a battle cry. The B-29 was not merely an airplane. It was a symbol of what happens when invention, organization, and wealth converge on a single purpose. Each one represented thousands of people who never fired a gun yet changed the shape of war. The bombers that crossed the Pacific were not born from hate, but from calculation. They were the offspring of spreadsheets and blueprints of engineers and laborers who understood that in the 20th century, wars would no longer be won by heroes, but by systems. For Japan, the lesson came too late. By the time the atomic bombs fell, the empire was already broken, burned not by nuclear fire, but by the quiet, relentless logic of production. The air raids had proven that the future belonged to nations that could build faster than others could bleed. The ruins of Tokyo were not just a defeat, they were a prophecy of the modern age. A former factory worker in Nagoya would later say, "We thought the Americans were giants. They were not. They were ordinary people who learned how to multiply themselves. That multiplication, the ability to turn human effort into mechanical infinity, became the true weapon of the century." If you stood amid those ashes, would you see tragedy or transformation? Comment 1. If you believe this was the moment humanity entered the age of industrial warfare, or hit. Like if you think the real battle has always been between creation and destruction, and both still live within us.